Hello everyone, good afternoon. So welcome to today's presentation. Initially this was a 45-minute presentation, now it's 15. So we're going to do it a little bit differently. But ask yourself the question, you bought Splunk and you're trying to figure out how do I get value out of this thing? Or you're trying to create a capability within your organization. How are you going to do that? Because sometimes it is the case that you're kind of following a map and writing a map at the same time. And that can be a little bit frustrating. So I've had a lot of experience of doing this over the years. So at the moment I'm Chief Data and Analytic Officer for CSS in California. I've also worked at John Lewis in the UK. If anybody's seen that Splunk customer success story, that was me. Worked in Tesco in the UK, CTO Data Analytics for Computer Center in the UK. I also run the Splunk user group for London. That's the largest Splunk user group in the world, actually. So I've got a lot of exposure to a lot of customers, a lot of use cases, a lot of problems. So I'm kind of fortunate that I have that exposure. But what do I do with that? What do I see that's common amongst those use cases? Yeah. What can we take from that and modularize and put in place to help people get from A to B? In fact, what is A to B? So what I've done is I've distilled these years of experience into what I'm referring to as a data value framework. So essentially what we can do is we can have the dots and join them, because we want to be delivering continuously, having outcome continuously. So let me just bring this up for a second. So what I want to focus on is assessments to see where we are, considerations so we can see the pitfalls, and outcomes so we can get value and ROI. So what I've come up with is this. So I've broken down the whole gamut of, hey, I want to do something with analytics or Splunk, because that conversation can exhaust itself in no time. You want to have the buy-in at the beginning and you want to have the vision at the beginning. So what I've done is I've broken it down into 10 pillars. And for each of those pillars, there are considerations that you should be aware of from day one. And for each of those pillars, there's also outcomes that we have for those pillars. So let me take you through the journey and see how you feel about that. So if we look at the first one, which is data understanding. So what I'm saying here, for data understanding, you might want to go into an organization, maybe give them a data 101. Maybe some people think that data is something that comes out of a structured database, whereas we know 95% of all data is unstructured, so maybe we've got to teach them that, okay? There could be assumptions that we don't want to have festering. Also, we might want to do an art of the possible workshop with them. Who's doing what in similar industries? What things do you want to do to bring yourself going forward? Maybe get the organizational perspective. So, what are the strategic directions of the company? What are the strategic imperatives? You really want to be aligning what it is you'd like to achieve with those strategic imperatives. And by that I mean, look, ultimately you want to be aiming for business outcomes. So if you're doing some work and there's no business outcome at the end of it, you're just doing a science project and you're going to fail. You want to fail fast. Always be sure you're aligning to business outcomes, going towards organizational adoption and ultimately adding business value. But when you get this kind of thing in place, what's going to come out the other side of it is a vision and strategy. So now we have a framework, we have a foundation to bring us forward. And then if we go to the next one, use cases. So use cases are everything. If you haven't got use cases, you're just like it's tough. It's pretty tough, yeah. So what I'm saying, for use cases, let's break it down. So we want to do use case workshops. If I had the longer session we're doing right now, we do our use case workshops. But what we would do with those use cases, we would validate them and we would verify them. But not alone would we do that, we'd ensure we have executive sponsorship for the use case. And then we'd also have a business prioritization. So then we know we have a structured use case, we know what the value is, we know what business outcome it's going towards. It has executive sponsors in case we go forward and the seas become choppy. We have that backup, don't we? But from what comes out of that then is going to be a prioritized backlog. So now we're getting some structure. We've got a vision and a strategy. We've got the prioritized backlog. So I'm feeling I've got a structure here. But ultimately, this outcome is where the ROI is. So I've added the ROI of having my vision and strategy. I've had my prioritized backlog. I can explain where I'm going, and I can tie that to my business outcomes. So then you might want to consider architecture and engineering. Sometimes this gets all mixed up in one. But if you break it down into more than one item, well, let's have a look at the data, the architecture, the availability, scalability, maintenance. A lot of people put Splunk straight into a live situation, and all of a sudden, a few months later, oh my God, there's no governance, I don't know what to do, just put a pillow over my head. That can happen. But if we call them out at the beginning and say, look, we have these considerations, what can we do to be addressing those considerations ahead of time? So therefore, we have time to mitigate the considerations if there is an action to be taken. But then what are you going to have when you go through all of these things for architecture and engineering? Well, you're going to have a resilient platform. So you're adding value, adding structure, giving confidence back to the business. But then data analytics. Now I'm calling out data analytics as something that's different to data science. So for data analytics, I might want to have a look at the behaviors of my systems, my users, my entities. Entity could be a phone, it could be a network device, it could be anything. But I want to have a look at orphan data. So when I say orphan data, that to me is we all have these Excel spreadsheets, and I've done something to it, and it's my spreadsheet. Now, it's in my pocket, it's valuable to me, it's not valuable to the organization, so it's an orphan spreadsheet. But by using terms like that, you think that's not good, yeah? It's a bit like data huggers, yeah, and data cartels, you know, that kind of stuff. But what you want to be looking at here in the data analytics is maybe root cause analysis, your monitoring, your alerting, your actionable intelligence. But just one point there, actionable intelligence is really pointless without action. Yeah? Not a lot of people actually get that all the time. But then to have the action, you might need to have an alignment with a process that doesn't exist. Yeah? That's in the next stage. But from this breakdown of data analytics, what will come out the other side in terms of outcome is some speed and efficiency. I feel now I'm getting ahead of steam. So I'm getting more and more confidence as I go along. And that's just a presentation. So then in terms of data gathering, what you might want to be considering there is the data ownership. Now you want to know that if you've got a use case that's validated, has a sponsor, when it comes to the crunch of can I have the data, you don't want to have a data cartel to say, no, you're not getting your grubby hands on my data because I'm security and you're not. So you want to call that out up front. So that's where you would have your executive sponsor who could maybe come in from a hierarchical position to ensure you're going to get that data. But you're going to have onboarding, maybe a bit of discovery. You're probably going to find servers that we never knew existed, we never decommissioned. But then what's your retention, what's your storage? Is there any security implication? Are you doing it for compliance? So there's quite a few things there to factor in terms of data gathering. But what comes out the other side of that? It's accessible data. Yeah? So it's now plugging together. I think the jigsaw is taking shape. And then following on from that, we have what I would call system synergy. Maybe other people call it integration. But let's call it system synergy. It sounds a bit simpler. Because ultimately, what do we want to do? Demystify and democratize. So let's call it a simple name. So we want to connect our instance of Splunk into our systems we already have, harmonize our standards. We want to maybe integrate with some projects. So maybe we'll introduce a stage in a project very early on that they must be considering the analytics when it will go live rather than at the time. So if you're going to generate systems, at that point in time, if we come in early, we can ensure that we're writing logs with the type of information we need to drive the dashboards that we require. So think about it up front. So therefore, now you know there's probably a collaboration effort to be done with the project teams. But your interoperability, your workflows, what is it you want to do? What's the journey that's going to happen when you're implementing Splunk? So let's think about that journey. Who's going to log in? What are they typically going to do? Let's put something in place to enable that success to happen. And then do we want to consider IoT, sensors? But once we think about our integration here, or a system synergy, what's going to be the outcome for that one? Well, collaboration and a stable foundation. So all these outcomes are giving me a lot of confidence. I feel like I've spent good money, but I'm getting my return for it. Now the data science might kick in. So I've got a data scientist, he's a PhD, he works for me in California. I don't want him to be onboarding data. Because why should he be? He's a scientist. I want him to be doing the data science. I don't want him to be looking at agile ways of working. I want him to be doing the data science. So we can have specializations in our consultants if we want, but also rather than have one consultant attacking one area, we can have 10 consultants doing this in parallel. So we're hitting it faster, we're hitting it better, and we have our specializations, so we have more confidence and cadence. But in terms of the data science here, we can have a look at forecasting, machine learning, your correlation, your KPIs, metrics we heard on the keynote today as well, quite important. So let's factor that stuff in, let's call it out, and then what's going to be the outcome for that? Well, we're going to have some deep insight, which should lead to opportunity. I know it's going to lead to opportunity because ultimately, when I was at use case stage, I was going towards business outcomes. So it should be leading to an opportunity. Otherwise, the use case test wouldn't have passed its test, would it? Another thing we might want to do as well, because we want this to be repeatable as well. Yeah, we might do education for all of these sections. We want to have self-service analytics. So rather than me ask somebody the same question every week for the same report that takes so much hours. I had a situation in a previous company. There was a lady spent 3 days a week, a month, doing some manipulation of data. Amazing work. I went to speak to her, and I turned 3 days a month into a button click. Just by listening and going through this sort of thing. And that was great but shocking. Yeah. So ultimately, in the self-service, you want to have links into your knowledge management, right? So people can help themselves. Maybe some guided reporting. So there's a set of reports that maybe you can give in parameters. That might be dates, departments, whatever it might be in terms of your parameters. But then maybe some health checking. You know, run some health checking to see that it's okay. Why should I have to call the IT service desk to run a health check? I can just do it myself 24/7, 365. So let's put it out there. So we'll reduce the overhead we have on our support team so they can get on and do more interesting stuff. And then you're empowered. Because ultimately a framework like this is about empowering, democratizing, allowing people to move forward, which then fosters innovation. So but at the end of this, in terms of self-service analytics, well, what are we going to get for that? I mean, we're going to get some self-sufficiency, 24/7 service, and now we're going to have the ability to do some automation. Whether it's guided automation, the likes of Resolve Systems, very good at that. Whether it's end-to-end automation, it's up to you. But ultimately, let's call these out early so we can start to plan for these. Yeah. So in the next one, ways of working. So I've come up with use cases. What did we have? A prioritized backlog. How are you going to execute on that prioritized backlog? How are you going to deliver? You need some level of mechanism. So I have worked with companies who were doing tremendous work, but were actually doing nothing. Because it was a means to an end, shouting in the wind. And that's demoralizing, okay? You don't want to have that situation. But if you can take your prioritized backlog and have a mechanism, a conveyor belt, to realize the value from it, you're in a really, really strong place. So that the considerations we might have here might be agile practices. Are we going to do it in a Kanban way, a Scrum way, daily stand-ups, all that kind of good stuff? Because that stuff might already exist within the company. So let's just apply what they have in the enterprise to what we're doing in Splunk. Let's give some discipline and rigor to the kind of things we want to do in Splunk. Not a problem. But we mentioned project staging gates before as well. You know, put aside some funding to make sure your analytics are going to represent what good looks like when you're going to go live. And then you're going to have your delivery platform, but always think about continuous improvement. So a question I would never ask anybody who works for me is how long did it take? All that matters is how long is to go. Because we work toward business outcomes, yeah? When you do a retrospective, we think about, was there something I could have done to help that execute faster? Is there better training? But on the job, you don't want to be asking how long did it take. It's completely pointless. But what would be the outcomes then of ways of working? Well, confidence, capability, cadence, and modeling. So I'm much more into modeling than muddling. So with modeling, I can have the right people create the models that other people can then execute. If the model has some flaws, we fix the model with the experts, and then the other people can deliver the model. That's a good way to work, because your cost of delivery is going to be cheaper, your consistency is going to be higher, because you're following the model. So you don't have to be an expert. And I need to rush a little bit here. And then in terms of apps, what you might want to do is maybe encapsulate some of your functionality into an app. So maybe you can have some intellectual property around that, and you can look at performance, have development against it, cross-charging. But at the end of that, you might have intellectual property, framework, and protection of your investment. And the final bit I'd call out here is you want to have your organizational transformation. This is where the budgets are if you're trying to sell in. This is where the influences are if you're internal. So in here, you might want to be considering governance, structure, audit control, business metrics, lean culture, coaching, user groups, enablement, education, strategy, standard operating procedures. That's the stuff you have to address from an organizational perspective. You must address that. If you don't address that, you might not go over the edge. Actually, you might go over the edge, but not over the finishing line. You've got to be careful on that. But what's going to be your outcome there? Well, growth and scale. Right? We've got confidence, assurance, a competitive edge, and a stronger ROI. So by dividing it up, we divide and conquer. I can have specific training around this, specific training around this. People have more focus. So rather than somebody going in all flustered, what do I do? Actually, I'm coming in to do a repeatable model that I've delivered many times to many companies. So we have that quality, that consistency, the reliability, the repeatability, and the assurance, and we can just make it happen. So if we can break it down, it makes it simpler to understand. Because data analytics is not just one thing, it's many things. And for me, that's the representation of how one would break that down and what the journey might be. This could also be a circle though, yeah? Because you might find that you're doing some of these together, or it might be done in parallel with different departments. But ultimately, what is it? It's a framework. It's a way forward. We'll fail fast, we'll succeed well. Thank you very much. Any questions?